Okay, so we're going to move into the second category of bones on your list, the vertebral column. We're going to go through the structures of a typical vertebra first, and then we'll look at the structures that are distinctive on the particular types of vertebrae. Okay, so every vertebra, regardless of whether it is cervical, thoracic, or lumbar vertebra, should have all of these particular landmarks. Okay, so the first one is the body. Now the body will look different depending on the type of vertebra that you have. Okay, but the body is this section that makes the column that is separated by the intervertebral discs. Okay, so there'd be another body of another vertebra stacked here, another body of another vertebra stacked here. And this is the part of the vertebra that really takes all the compressions as we're moving around. Okay, the vertebral foramen is the big opening inside each vertebra. Okay, and that vertebral foramen is the location where the spinal cord would be found. Okay, it's pretty amazing. You know, when you look, this is an actual human vertebra, and we think of the spinal cord as being so important, but wow, that's a pretty small space, isn't it? So the spinal cord is important, but it is not very big. Okay, and that's with cerebrospinal fluid, fat surrounding it, the different layers of the meninges, so there's not that much tissue there. Okay, especially in this section of the spinal cord. Okay, now on vertebrae, there are always processes that are pointing laterally. Those are the transverse processes. There's also always a piece of bone pointing posteriorly. That is the spinous process. Okay? There are also processes that allow the vertebrae to interact with each other. Okay, so to know these, you have to know which side is the superior side of your vertebra and which is the inferior side of your vertebra. Okay, so as I'm holding this vertebra here, I have it in the correct anatomical orientation. Okay, so this would be anterior. Okay, so pointing toward the body cavities. This would be posterior over here, pointing toward the posterior surface. Okay, and you'll notice that the spinous process is pointing inferiorly. Okay, I'm going to pick up another type of vertebra just to show you that it works with all of them. Okay, now again, here's the body of this vertebra. Here's the spinous process, and you can see we've moved inferiorly as we've moved to the spinous process. Okay, so this is the correct orientation for a vertebra. Okay, now on a vertebra in that orientation, then the locations that I'm pointing to here would be the superior articular processes. Okay, so these would be what would fit against the processes of another vertebra to allow the one that's kind of the next highest in the column to fit with this one. Okay, and then this vertebra also has to fit with the one that's inferior to it or lower than it, so it also will have inferior articular processes. Okay, now we also have to have openings on the sides, because the whole point of having a spinal cord is that you have nerves that allow you to connect with the periphery. Okay, so here we have a set of vertebrae, and we have our vertebral foramen here. This is where the spinal cord would be. Okay, and then you can see once these two vertebrae are together, the one vertebra makes half of the opening and the one next to it makes the other half of an opening. And this opening is the intervertebral foramen. Okay, so this probe we could think of as a nerve that would be connecting to the spinal cord, and that nerve would be carrying messages to and from the spinal cord to let us know what's going on out in the periphery and to allow us to make changes out in the periphery if we need to. Okay, so those are the structures that should be on any vertebrae. Let's start taking a look at the individual vertebrae so we can see what's special about each one. Okay, so this is a very special cervical vertebra. This is the atlas. Okay, and I'm going to put it in this orientation since this is the way it would sit in the body. Okay, so these are the superior articular processes of the atlas. These processes actually fit against the occipital condyles to allow you to have a nice gliding joint in that location. Okay, now you also have inferior articular processes. Okay, and this is a very atypical vertebra because it has transverse processes, which I'm tapping on, but it has no body and it has no spinous process. Okay, so it's kind of strange looking, but it needs this shape because it needs to be able to fit effectively with the skull and still allow us to have movement. Now, its closest neighbor is cervical vertebra 2, which is referred to as the axis. Okay, now you'll notice that the axis has this beautiful protrusion from its body, which is called the dens. The other name you'll see in your textbook and lab manual is the odontoid process, which is telling you that it's kind of a tooth-like process. But I like dens better. It's easier to spell, that's for sure. Okay, so remember, inferior articular processes are going to meet with the superior articular processes of the next bone. And here we go. This is how our atlas and our axis fit together. Okay, now the reason the atlas can't have a body is because the dens has to fit up into where the body would be. And you'll notice in this part of the atlas, it looks like it's had some wear and tear here, and there's a little bit of a place where it looks like there's been some changes that have happened in this bone here. And that really has happened because this is the part of the atlas that rests against the dens. And when we're moving our head, making a nice rotation on this pivot axis here, or pivot joint, we do a lot of rubbing on this part of the atlas, and so it kind of remodels itself there to deal with that. Okay, so those are the two special cervical vertebrae. Then we have a typical cervical vertebra here. So let's talk about what its features are. So the body of a cervical vertebra should be fairly small and compact. The transverse processes should have openings in them. Okay, and those are the transverse foramina. Okay, foramina is plural, foramen is singular. Okay, so each one would be a transverse foramen. Together, they are the transverse foramina. Okay, and the reason that the cervical vertebrae, and I'm going to put all three of them together here, the reason that they have these transverse foramina is because there's an artery, excuse me, I'm using the wrong prefix here. There's an artery that goes through these transverse foramina, appropriately named the vertebral artery, that you'll learn about in A&P2. Okay, some other features of cervical vertebrae are they have a triangular shaped vertebral foramen, and the spinous process is typically forked. Now this one's a little bit broken so you can't see the fork. They describe it in your lab manual and textbook as being bifid. That means it's forked. Okay, so it makes a little tiny Y here. Okay, so those are all characteristics of cervical vertebrae. Cervical are also the smallest because they have the least stress on them. Okay, then We have thoracic. Thoracic vertebrae have a beautiful heart-shaped body surface, which is very sweet. Okay. They also will have these costal facets, or slight depressions, on their transverse processes. And this is where they, I'm going to stick this rib in here, this is where they would interact with the ribs. Okay, so you can see this bump on the rib, the tubercle fits into that location. Okay. All right, also distinctive on the thoracic vertebra is it has a nice round vertebral foramen, and it typically has a very pointy spinous process. Okay, so it looks like you could use it as a weapon. Okay, it's so pointy. Okay. Now, you notice we're kind of getting bigger in size as we're going along. Here's the big one. This is the lumbar vertebra. Okay, and lumbar vertebrae are characterized by a large body that usually has an oval or bean-shaped surface, a triangular vertebral foramen, and a spinous process that is short and kind of blunted. Okay, so it has a nice rounded appearance, not the dagger-like quality of the thoracic vertebra. Okay, so they're lined up. I'm going to put them all out for you. You can see all of those vertebrae and all of their different shapes there quite nicely. Move this out of the way. Okay, now in addition to these single vertebrae, and I should mention before we go on, there's only one of C1 and one of C2, but these are a type of cervical vertebra, and to remember the typical number of vertebrae, just think of meal times. Okay, so you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. Okay, so the typical number of cervical vertebra is 7. Typical number of thoracic vertebra is 12. Typical number of lumbar vertebra is 5. Okay, so these are all the unfused vertebrae. Then we have a couple of types of vertebrae that are fused together to make larger structures. Okay, one is the sacrum. Okay, so the sacrum started out life as several individual vertebrae that fused together to form the structure that you see. And actually you can see on this surface where the intervertebral discs used to be that have now been replaced by a calcified tissue. So you can see it looks like we had 5 unfused vertebrae that fused together to make the sacrum, and that's the typical number. Okay, so instead of having a spinous process, we have a ridge on the posterior surface which is the median sacral crest. Instead of having transverse processes, we have fused transverse processes that make wing-like structures. Those are the alae of the sacrum. Okay, singular for that would be ala, A-L-A. Okay, and then instead of having intervertebral foramina, we have sacral foramina. Okay, because we don't need 2 vertebrae together to make the halves of the opening here. They're already there. Okay, last but not least, we have the coccyx, which is typically formed from the fusion of 4 small vertebrae, and this is now really a site of ligament attachment, and it also gives us an attachment for actually for the membranes associated with the spinal cord. Their inferior attachment is there as well.